As India and Pakistan tensions rise, what has China got to gain? Plenty. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Before I begin, YouTube is promoting pro-CCP content and trying to silence shows like China Uncensored. When I did an incognito search on YouTube for China, the first China Uncensored video that came up was number 552. So, since YouTube loves the CCP so much, show how much you love the CCP by leaving a comment below with Chinese leader Xi Jinping's absolute favorite, a honeypot emoji. So once again, Pakistan and India are clashing over the disputed Jammu and Kashmir region. I cover a lot of clashes over disputed regions. Who knew the most controversial thing in the world were maps? U.S. President Donald Trump claims that he brokered a ceasefire between the two countries. But tensions are still high, with both countries accusing the other of violating the ceasefire, and India reportedly neutralizing several Pakistani drones just days ago. This temporary peace seems more precarious than a house of cards on a Jenga tower, on a workout ball, on a boat in the South China Sea. India claims that Pakistan was behind an Islamic terror attack on April 22nd in Pahalgam, an area in the disputed region popular with tourists for obvious reasons. Wow, that's pretty. 26 civilians were killed and appear to have been targeted based on their faith. Of course, Islamabad denies that it played any role in the attack. They were too busy picking up groceries for old ladies and bottling up puppy kisses. After all, it's been so honest and transparent about fighting terrorism. And since China also has a presence in the region, all along a disputed border with India, and has heavily invested in Belt and Road infrastructure in Pakistan, of course it decided to get involved by offering to mediate for a lasting ceasefire. China's like that neighbor that always butts in uninvited. Basically Kramer, but more racist. On the surface, this makes sense since a conflict in Asia that drives away investment won't help Beijing's faltering economy or BRI projects. Plus, the Chinese Communist Party has tried many times over the years to play peacemaker, including in Ukraine and the Middle East. And when at first you don't succeed, or when at second you don't succeed, try again, knowing you probably still won't succeed. Of course, China may find it hard to play peacemaker in the India-Pakistan conflict, and not just because these two have been at it since literally before the CCP took power. The problem is, China isn't exactly a neutral party in all this. While the CCP had earlier condemned the Pahalgam terrorist attack, it also worked with Pakistan to water down a UNSC condemnation of the April 22nd attack. So basically they said, that's terrible, but not that terrible. Then China called for an impartial probe of the attack while voicing support for Pakistan's legitimate national security concerns and safeguarding its sovereignty. The CCP had nothing at all to say about Indian national security or sovereignty for obvious reasons. Meanwhile, there are some unconfirmed reports suggesting a rising anti-Indian narrative on TikTok, which I'm so glad the US is dragging its feet on banning. There are also unconfirmed reports of the Pakistan Air Force using Chinese satellites during the conflict, and China sending a large stock of military equipment to Pakistan. Basically, China is doing everything outside of packing Pakistan's lunch with a little note that says, "Have fun at war, sweetie." It's hard to say how accurate these reports are, but nonetheless, the fact is, China is on Pakistan's side here, no matter what it says about being a neutral arbiter. And that's not just because India and the CCP keep giving each other suspicious side-eye. This is about China seizing opportunities emerging from these clashes. Even Mr. Rogers wouldn't ask them to be his neighbor. So what kind of opportunities are we talking about? Well, for one thing, India being at war with Pakistan means it's paying less attention to disputed borders with China. Even though Indian and Chinese officials have been having talks to resolve their border differences, a weaker India could be easier to make a deal with, a deal that favors China anyway. Which is crazy because talks with China are always so productive and mutually beneficial. In addition, no matter who would win a hypothetical conventional conflict, India would lose soldiers, military equipment, and prestige. So it would be even more vulnerable to the PLA should China decide to invade India again. Yes, China and India fought a war on the border in the 60s. As for Pakistan's well-being, well, in the words of Lord Farquaad, that might be a sacrifice Beijing is willing to make. This conflict might be an opportunity for China to see just how capable India's military is, and its own. The CCP hasn't been involved in an active war since its ill-fated invasion of Vietnam in 1979. Guess they didn't learn anything from America's ill-fated war with Vietnam. And there's only so much you can learn from military exercises, even lots and lots of them. India's arsenal is made up mainly of Western, Russian, and Israeli weapons, while Pakistan has ramped up its imports of Chinese-made weapons, including the Chengdu J-10C, or Vigorous Dragon, which sounds like a euphemism for Viagra. The Vigorous Dragon is China's counterpart to the F-16 and entered service back in 2004. Although it's a homegrown project, it also drew inspiration from abroad, such as from Israeli fighters and Russian engine technology. According to Pakistan's foreign minister, these warplanes were involved in shooting down several Indian fighter jets, including the French-made Rafale fighter. So Chinese military tech beating Western tech. Now, to be fair, the reports coming out of this conflict are not exactly reliable. Claims from both sides are more exaggerated than guys' heights on dating sites. So it's hard to tell exactly which weapons are doing what to whom. That's right, I said whom. We practice proper grammar on this channel. But if the Vigorous Dragon did shoot down several Indian fighters, it's bad news for India and France and good news for China. Even just the rumor is good for China. Chengdu Aircraft Company stock soared by more than a third this week on the Shenzhen stock market, suggesting investor confidence in the Vigorous Dragon. Or, what's it good for? The economy. This could signal a major shift. Historically, Russian arms have been the go-to for much of the world. But after Russia's military equipment didn't deliver as expected in Ukraine, and sanctions kicked Russia's military-industrial complex to the ground, many countries turned to Western providers, remaining skeptical about the quality of Chinese-made weapons. Which makes sense since we should all be skeptical about the quality of Chinese-made anything. But now that could change. According to military observer Anthony Wong Dong, I swear I didn't make up that name, from the CCP's perspective, these Pakistani successes against Indian jets are essentially a powerful advertisement for China's arms industry. If only there were a way to put an ad blocker on reality. And we all know Beijing sure could use the cash and the boost in confidence on the world stage. Since the CCP hasn't been engaged in war for a very long time, even though it keeps fantasy booking them flash mob style, it also gets feedback on its own equipment, what works well and what doesn't, and what might need some fine-tuning. I can't think of any scenario where that might come in handy. Nope, not one. Of course, the conflict isn't all good for China. As I said, Chinese troops haven't fought a war since Vietnam in 1979, while the India-Pakistan conflict is giving Indian troops some level of actual experience. And if China is getting data on the effectiveness of its weapons, so are India and the West. And it's not all good news. Experts are also pointing out that the Indian strikes did successfully hit Pakistani targets in multiple locations. Pakistani air defense systems largely rely on the Chinese-made HQ-9B system. One defense expert with London's Asia-Pacific Foundation says that if Chinese-made origin radar or missile systems fail to detect or deter Indian strikes, that's also bad optics for Beijing's arms export credibility. But it might all be worth it to the CCP in the long run if India takes a hit militarily and economically. India's military has been growing and getting stronger over the past several years. In addition, just a few years ago, India's population surpassed China's. It's amazing what not instituting a one-child policy can do for a census. Between a low birth rate and rapidly aging population, that bodes poorly for the Chinese economy, which is already struggling with the after effects of zero COVID, low domestic consumption, high youth unemployment, and the real estate debt crisis. But I'm sure all these catastrophic outlooks for the future are putting Chinese citizens right in the mood for bringing a child into the world. And it's on the economic front that China is most concerned by India. As it's grown closer to the West, India is presenting itself as a potential alternative to China in many ways. including a Trump-promoted trade corridor that bypasses the BRI project and runs from India to Europe through the Middle East. Then there's India's move to align with President Trump's China tariffs. For example, after years of Indian officials criticizing the CCP's economic practices, New Delhi recently imposed a 12% tariff on steel to curb cheap Chinese imports. And in the wake of the US-China tariff war, Apple CEO Tim Cook said the majority of US iPhone sales in Q3 will be made in India. There were a lot of expectations that India was going to snap up many of the businesses that fled China to avoid the tariffs. Naturally, that wouldn't please the CCP. Now, with the conflict looming between India and Pakistan, India could look much more unattractive and unstable for investors, especially since both New Delhi and Islamabad have nuclear weapons. It looks more unstable than a house of cards on a Jenga tower, on a workout ball, on a boat in the South China Sea, under a mushroom cloud. At the same time, all of a sudden the US and China are engaged in serious economic talks that could result in a trade deal. Already tariffs are being lowered between Beijing and Washington. All good for the CCP. It's unclear where these clashes between Pakistan and India will go from here, but what's certain is that there's a third party very much involved in this long-running feud. And this episode is sponsored by you. Every week I make 4 free episodes of China Uncensored for everyone to enjoy on YouTube, because my goal is to tell as many people as possible about the Chinese Communist Party. I can only afford to do that with your support. Subscribe to my new premium website, ChinaUncensored.tv. It has a bunch of exclusive content that doesn't get put on YouTube. Plus, you'll be making these free episodes possible for everyone else to learn about China. The link to the website is below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.